Hello, my name is Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Empathy Center located here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. The center's mission is to build the empathy movement and to raise the level of empathy in society through education and community building initiatives.
And my name is Anita Nowak. I teach at McGill University, and I'm the author of Purposeful Empathy, a book that invites readers to turn up the volume of empathy in their lives.
And at the beginning of 2024, Anita and I co-hosted the Empathy Summit, brought to you by the Empathy Center, and more than 40 authors of books about empathy participated.
They shared what their book was about, why they were motivated to write it, and what they hope readers will take away. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you'll buy their book. It's now my pleasure to introduce everyone to Dr. Julinna Oxley, who is a professor and director of the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values at Coastal Carolina University. She is the author of The Moral Dimensions of Empathy, Limits and Applications in Ethical Theory and Practice. Over to you, Julinna.
Great, thank you. It's great to follow Heidi. She's definitely a tough act to follow, and I've learned a lot from her. Thanks everybody for being here today. I'll just go ahead and launch into a bit about why I wrote my book. Or I'm sorry, you've given me 3 questions and you want to know what the book is about. So I spend some time, like Heidi does, beginning with just trying to understand what empathy is, and looking at the role that it plays in, as Heidi was saying, our understanding. So our intellectual understanding, including like our epistemic functions of how we form beliefs. And I think empathy is a really important way that we form beliefs about other people. And sometimes that's, as she said, from a third person perspective, and sometimes it's from a first person perspective. The thing is that it can get really icky. And so when I first started thinking about this, I started thinking about it as a kind of a model of how we form beliefs in general. And so for when you're thinking about yourself, you imagine you're in your own perspective, wearing your own shoes, and you know what your circumstances are, you know what your beliefs are, you know what your motivations are. But then when you try to empathize with someone, you try to do all of that stuff, but in their position. And sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you get it wrong because you don't know who they are, and you might be missing some relevant facts or details about their lives that would make you a better empathizer with them. So one of the things that emerges in the literature, which has already been discussed, is that we're kind of biased in our empathy, and that we actually get better at empathizing with people who are similar to us because we have more in common with them. And then the further we get away from our own social sphere, maybe even our gender, our race, our nationality, the further we get afield, the harder it is for us to empathize with them. And so by at least acknowledging that, I think it gives us a little humility, which we might need sort of going into different circumstances, because otherwise we're going to feel like we don't have anything to learn from anybody else. Like, I already know who you are. I can empathize with you. But the more that we pay attention and are relevant, or pay attention to the circumstances that people are in, the more we'll realize, maybe I do need to put a more concerted effort into empathizing with this person and paying attention to who they are and their thoughts and beliefs and actions. So that's just the first part of the book. And then I try to look and see how that plays out in our moral life. So the emphasis that had been in the psychological literature is that empathy pretty much generates altruism, right? That you're nice to people. Like, you see somebody on the side of the road, you see them starving and they're begging, they're a veteran, and they seem homeless, and maybe they don't have somewhere to stay. They may have mental health problems. And so you're like, I'm going to give you $5. Right. And so you sort of just automatically empathize with them, and you do something with them that is altruistic in nature. But when it comes to looking at our moral actions, altruism isn't always the right action to take, right? It can be, and I'd say probably 80% of the time an altruistic action is a good one, but there are other types of actions that we should consider as well. And so what I do is I look and see how empathy can play a role in not just altruism or giving people other things in order to increase their well-being, but to deliberate about what's right and wrong. And so there's lots of different ethical theories about how this has been approached. Kantian ethics looks at moral principles that we would, choose that could satisfy the first principle of the categorical imperative. Is this something that could be universalized that I could ask everyone to do? Does this treat this person as a means to an end? And so I sort of show how empathy can be used in those types of deliberations as well. It's not just like if you want to be nice to somebody, but it's in other kinds of deliberations. And then I go really kind of far afield and I say, if we're doing political theory and if we're looking at, how we can build just societies, empathy is really important there. And I was writing this kind of gets into my second question about why I wrote this book on empathy. And the main reason is that I was writing a dissertation that was in political theory, and my dissertation advisor, who unfortunately has passed on now. His name is Jerry Gauss, and he's a very, very well-known political philosopher. And he and I would have these conversations about, how we should, build a good society, a just society, and what does a just society look like? And so we would debate Rawls and Hayek and all these other, political theorists. And his assumption was always, you're a rational agent and you're self-interested. And when we do political theory, we assume that everybody's a self-interested agent. And so you can generate a whole theory about a social contract and how we can all work in society based on just self-interest. And I thought, that's weird. That doesn't seem right at all. It seems like we've got to have some kind of goodwill towards each other. If we're completely self-interested, we are just going to end up back in a Hobbesian society where it's a war of all against all. And so I went back to some of these contemporary political thinkers that he was asking me to read, and I say, they're doing empathy right here. They're not calling it empathy, but what they're modeling is empathetic thinking. And he was like, what? And initially I thought it was benevolence. I thought about benevolence for about 6 months, and I was getting all mixed up because I was coming at this not from psychology. I was coming at it from political theory. And once we started digging into it, he was like, you're totally right. This is empathy. Like, what they are doing is empathetic deliberation. And so when I wrote my dissertation, the dissertation itself was actually a very long exploration of how empathetic thinking is a part of Rawls's theory of justice, which is, a very well-known and probably the most influential theory of justice that we have, which helps to justify the world that's around us today with a social safety net and education and, Section 8 housing and food stamps and, unemployment, not insurance, but when you get unemployment for being fired and things like that. So all those things are things that Rawls argued for. And I said, the way he gets there is by imagining being in somebody else's position who's in that circumstance. And he was like, okay, I never thought about it that way. So that was my real motivation at the time, was trying to prove to somebody who does political theory that John Harsanyi, who's sort of another famous economist, he's a utilitarian economist. I was like, look, that's what he's doing right here. And he's like, yep, you're right. And Kurt Beyer, who's kind of an egoist, but philosopher, and he builds a moral theory based on egoism. I said, look, even though he's doing egoism, it's still empathy. And so that really is what launched my project. And, thankfully I had a dissertation advisor in philosophy who was very open to empirical data. You would think that this would be important. And sometimes philosophers are like, we're just going to write philosophy and ideal theories that don't have anything to do with what actual human beings are like. And I'm like, that's a terrible approach. So it was great. We were very open. So I read so much work in psychology. I'd learned so much. Thankfully, my mom's a psychologist. So she helped me get launched in the right direction. And at the end of the day, in learning so much about moral psychology, that really became my focus. both in the book and then in my research following several years later, once I started writing more, was really trying to think about the role that empathy can play in our lives, in our daily lives. And it's not just one thing, right? It can be a lot of different things. So, so those answers are sort of what the main gist of my book is about. I would hope that what readers take away from reading my book is that empathy has many moral purposes. It's not just one thing. It can help you deliberate about how to not just be kind or generous or benevolent or altruistic towards someone, but it can help you think about how punishment might need to work better in society, in a just society, or maybe even in your family with your children. It can help you think better about solving problems of political intractability, which we seem to have right now, which is gridlock of people being unable and unwilling to talk to each other because the terms and concepts they're using just literally don't intersect, right? So empathy can be a really good tool for that. It can also be cultivated. So one of the things that I tried to emphasize in my book, I'm a little bit of a virtue theorist. I really like Aristotle, and you can learn empathy, but if you start really late in life, it's going to be harder. So start as early as you can learning empathy. So I think I'm at the end of my time.
Julinna, thank you so much for sharing. You've generated a lot of conversation in the chat box, so I invite you to check that out afterwards.
Great.
Thank you
I'll
so
do
much
that.
for being part of this really astounding lineup of empathy authors.